Okay. All right. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to the Research Ethics and Policy series. My name is Holly Fernandez-Lynch. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy, and I co-chair REPS along with Steve Jaffe. Today, we are really excited to welcome Dr. Scott Halpern, who's going to be discussing his team's work to study the ethically relevant impact of paying research participants. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Halpern in just a second, but I'm going to go ahead with our usual announcements. Those of you who are here every month are probably sick of these by now, but we always have some new faces in the crowd. As a reminder, the lectures are recorded unless we state otherwise, but this one is recorded. And we will post the video to the Medical Ethics and Health Policy website just as soon as it's ready, which will be within a couple of days or a week or so. You can see the upcoming REPS speaker lineup for the academic year on the screen right now. And we have more information about the speakers and their planned topics on the MEHP events calendar, which Mary will post in the chat. For the last REPS lecture of the year, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Kim Smith-Whitley on ethics and policy in sickle cell research. And then in January, we'll be back with Dr. Justin Clapp, who will be discussing community consultation for emergency research. And please don't forget, if there are people that you would like to hear from in this series, especially individuals from diverse backgrounds and who could contribute diverse perspectives to issues relevant to research ethics and policy, we are very open to suggestions. I can't promise to get people on the calendar, probably before 2023 at this point. We have a long list of folks, but we are always adding to that list. So please reach out to me or Mary Pham with anybody that you would especially like to hear from or topics that you would like to see covered in this series. And just a quick reminder about some of the online resources that our department has available relevant to research ethics and policy. These are available for free continuing education credit, and some can also be used to satisfy the research ethics training requirements at Penn and CHOP. And you can find the links to those on the screen, and then Mary will post them in the chat. And a thank you, of course, to all of the REPS co-sponsors and to Mary Pham for all of her help organizing this series. Okay. So with that, I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Scott Halpern, who is the John M. Eisenberg Professor of Medicine, Epidemiology, Medical Ethics, and Health Policy, and the founding director of the Palliative and Advanced Illness Research Center, or PAIR, at the Perelman School of Medicine here at Penn. Dr. Halpern's research combines empirical approaches from the fields of epidemiology, health services research, and the decision-making sciences with conceptual work grounded in moral philosophy. His work centers on three core areas: allocation of scarce health resources, use of behavioral economic approaches to improve patient and provider decisions, especially those related to end-of-life care, and improving the ethics and efficiency of randomized controlled trials by examining the consequences of incentives for research participation. And that last topic is what we are going to be hearing about today. So Scott, thank you so much for joining us. The plan will be that Scott is planning to pause for a couple of moments periodically throughout his talk. If you have any clarifying questions, you can go ahead and put those in the chat, and I will make sure that they are shared. And then we'll save some time towards the end where you'll be able to unmute and share your own questions. Okay, let me stop sharing so you can get your slides up.
All right, that work, Holly?
You're all set.
Super. Well, thanks for the kind introduction and for you and Steve for inviting me to give this talk. This is one of those actually super fun talks to give in a sense, as it represents something I've been thinking about literally since I was a graduate student 20-ish years ago. And it's really nice to see this work sort of culminate in some ways, but like all intriguing scholarship, the process of advancing the field also highlights new questions and areas that are desperately in need of further work, hence the title. So by way of background, it's important to highlight the motivation for why we think about incentivizing recruitment into randomized trials, or really any prospective research for that matter, but I'll focus my comments on RCTs. So we know that if we don't accrue a substantial proportion of participants, namely the target sample size, randomized trials end up being underpowered, which means they have high risks for type 2 errors or false negative conclusions. And arguably that is in and of itself unethical to put some patients or other research subjects under the risks and or burdens of science without the science having the potential to deliver on meeting its public health goals if it's simply not adequately designed. In addition to the problem of being underpowered, there's also the problem of selective enrollment, which is to say that the people who are enrolled in randomized trials may not reflect the characteristics of the people to whom the knowledge would be applied. And that produces a situation in which, although the results are internally valid, they may simply not generalize to all of the people in whom we would then apply the learnings. Zeke Emanuel has highlighted how prolonged recruitment is also a social or economic problem, in the sense that there's a finite number of research dollars and an essentially infinite number of important research questions. And if we could reduce the duration of participant recruitment in randomized trials, we would substantially reduce trial costs and thereby enable us to answer many more pressing questions than we're currently able to do. And then finally, and this is sort of a dated systematic review that I've referenced here, and there are more recent ones that yield the same disquieting conclusion, which is that very few interventions have been shown to meaningfully impact the recruitment rate. And I'll specifically define here what I call the enrollment fraction. And what I mean by the enrollment fraction as sort of the sine qua non of the problem we're wishing to highlight here and target is the proportion of people who are eligible for a study and who are approached through whatever means that study uses to participate and who actually do participate. So that's the problem we're trying to solve for here. So it's natural to think about incentivizing any behavior that is not being achieved at the rate that we would hope it would be. And there are a lot of policies and regulatory statutes on incentives, but they've yielded this highly variable state of affairs, where trials that use incentives are variably regulated across funding agencies. There are many examples of multi-site randomized trials where the same protocol is submitted to each institution's IRBs. This is substantially less of a problem now that we are increasingly using the model of single IRBs, but highlights the point that IRBs need more guidance anyway. When different IRBs review the same protocol using the same incentive, and they get back to the investigators with substantially different feedback about whether that is or isn't appropriate. And there are even examples, including here at Penn, where very similar studies with very similar incentives are reviewed very differently, even by the same IRB. So this is not, this may sound like I'm blaming IRBs, but I'm decidedly not. This is not IRB's fault. This is a problem with a lack of evidence and a lack of evidence-based guidance to show IRBs what they ought to be doing. And so to address this research, I want to differentiate what I call false concerns with what I'll call genuine concerns with payment. And what I mean here is I believe there have been a number of really lucid conceptual analyses, the best of which, for my money, so to speak, no pun intended, is by Luke Galinas, who's the first author, but Emily Largent and Holly Fernandez-Lynch contributed importantly to this paper in the New England Journal a few years back, where I think they really highlighted what the legitimate, or I'll call genuine, concerns with payment are. And these two that I'm showing here are not them. So the first concern that I want to just take out of the way for the moment is some people have argued that payment is unethical because it commodifies the body. The Russian philosopher Mikhail Waldman, in the last citation that I've printed there at the bottom of the slide, has argued persuasively about why this is just a logically inconsistent concern. But even more obviously than that detailed philosophical argument is the simple fact that bodies are commodified daily in all walks of life. Arguably, military service could be viewed as commodification of the body. Certainly, surrogate motherhood is unambiguously commodification of the body in the same way that research participation is. Surrogate mothers get paid upwards of $40K for carrying the fetus to term, sums of money that are used for an activity that is unambiguously higher risk than almost all randomized trials, and a sum of money that is unambiguously larger than any investigator would imagine to use. And yet that doesn't seem to generate the same sorts of concerns that payment for research participation does. So I'm not saying that that makes payments for research participation okay. I'm simply saying that I don't think commodification of the body is the real concern here. And I'll tell you what I do think the real concerns are. And then the second, and this is an argument that fortunately I haven't seen in some time, but it's one that the philosopher Carl Elliott at the University of Minnesota used to make, is that payment is unethical because it's often used in low quality or high risk research. That may be true in a descriptive sense, but it doesn't mean that those studies are unethical because they're using incentives. That those are just true and unrelated, right? It's not the incentives, or at least it doesn't logically follow that the fact that incentives are sometimes used in shitty studies is that the incentives themselves are what's making those studies lousy. So these are what I think are the real concerns, the legitimate ones, the ones that actually hang together logically. And I've used a sort of decreasing gray font to highlight what I think are their relative importance. The first concern is that payment may be an undue inducement, by which I mean that in the face of money, people may not think as clearly about risk as they would if money was not on the table. And that is problematic normatively because it has considerable implications for the possibility of autonomous decision-making and valid informed consent. The second possibility is that payment may be an unjust inducement, by which I mean that any given amount of money may be preferentially motivating for those who have less of it to begin with. And if that were true, then taken to a certain extreme of argument, it may be the case that we sort of create a research class, if you will, who bear the burdens and risks of scholarship. And the benefits of that research are then, in an ideal world, applied equally to everyone. But in the real world, it may be even worse, where those who tend to be better off or more advantaged in society tend to have greater access to the knowledge produced by research. So it's simply a justice problem. Now, I want to say that many have argued that I think quite strongly that this particular concern may have some limitations logically, philosophically, and I agree. But I do think it's a sufficiently important concern and one that is amenable to empirical work that it should be evaluated. And then finally, one that I think is largely an historical concern, but has been levied in the past, is that payment may lead research participants to lie effectively about their eligibility criteria for certain studies so that they can access the money. I think this is largely an historical concern because, these days, it's the very rare randomized trial that's simply taking what people say on face value and determining their eligibility. We're increasingly using electronic health records and other sources of sort of pre-existing quasi-objective data to determine someone's eligibility. And that in and of itself is sort of a technological advance that has reduced this concern. It was probably a concern that was pretty narrow in scope in the first place. And so I'm not going to address that one any further. So back when I was a graduate student, I had this grand idea that I was going to do this big study where we're going to partner with some big randomized trials, and we're going to randomly assign people to different incentive levels and evaluate the extent to which payments motivate research participation and lead or don't lead to either undue or unjust inducement. Of course, that proved quite challenging for a poor graduate student with few resources and insufficient connections. So I did the next best thing. And that is I recruited people from hypertension clinics and general medical practices around the University of Pennsylvania in collaboration with two of the prior rep speakers, as it turns out, Jason Karlowich and David Ash. And we randomly assigned these hypertensive patients, 126 of them, who had agreed to participate and had passed a sort of knowledge description about basic principles of randomized trials, like really basic. So just so we knew we had a relatively knowledgeable audience. And we randomly assigned a sequence of 9 different hypothetical randomized trials of a new antihypertensive medication. And in each of those 9, people indicated their willingness to participate in that trial if it was in fact being offered to them. And in those 9 trials differed in 2 key ways. We varied the payment that was offered, either $100, $1,000, or $2,000, and we varied what we told them about the risks of the intervention, from 10%, 20% to 30% chance of a variety of minor side effects such as headache and vomiting. Then we used both a within subjects design and an among subjects design to evaluate the extent to which incentives increased participation and to look at the relative influences of the payment and the risk and of patients' demographic characteristics, including their income. So I just want to pause here and for a thought experiment. So as to shape the rest of the talk, it's important to, I think probably everyone sort of understands the language that I use to describe undue and unjust inducement, but understanding that language and translating it into a statistically measurable construct are perhaps 2 different things. So that's what I'd like to highlight in the next few slides. So this is how I think about undue inducement. This is hypothetical, but you might imagine that for any given trial, without offering payment whatsoever, there is some inverse relationship between the amount of risk, as shown on the y-axis, and the proportion of people who are willing to participate, as shown on the x-axis. And so if that's the case in the absence of money, it may be that once we add payments, the curve shifts up, as you see here. That is not undue inducement. That is people making a rational trade-off that for any given level of risk, they're willing to do something that they may not be willing to do without money. You see the slopes of those curves are identical, which indicates that people are thinking about risk in the same way. They're just willing to do things for payment that they wouldn't do absent payment. There are lots of things I would do for payment that I wouldn't do absent payment. And I'm sure that's true for everyone on the call. And that's not something we typically regulate. What we would be concerned about and what would be an undue inducement would look like this. So not only are more people participating, but you can see the slope of the curve has changed. People aren't thinking about risk in exactly the same way. Their risk perception, if you will, has been blunted. Statistically, that's represented as an interaction between the variables of payment and the variable of risk on the variable of willingness to participate. And that is what is statistically representative of undue inducement, and that's a testable quantity. So in our hypothetical paper that actually was published in a journal that is no longer called what it was called Archives of Internal Medicine back then, it's now called JAMA Internal Medicine. You can see those three curves for $100, $1,000, and $2,000 are pretty darn parallel. There was a main effect of payment. More people participated, the higher the payment that was being offered, but there was no difference in the slopes of the curves as represented by the non-statistically significant p-value of the interaction term. Now I'd like to walk you through the conceptual model of unjust inducement. So again, hypothetically, we might imagine that in any given trial, there is, in this case, some direct relationship between the amount of money that's being offered and the proportion of people who are willing to participate. And let's suppose that this is what that curve happens to look like for quote unquote higher income people. Just for clarity of argument, I'm arbitrarily dichotomizing the world into high income and low income, but obviously it's not a dichotomous variable. It lives on a continuous scale. But again, just for purposes of clarity, let's just imagine there's this group of high income people, and for them in a given trial, the curve looks like this. In that same trial, it may be that lower income people have curves that look like either one of these. It may be that in the absence of payment, lower income people are more likely to participate, or in the absence of payment, lower income people are less likely to participate. But that either way, their relative incremental participation rate as a function of payment goes up at the same slope. This is not unjust inducement. First of all, if one of these two curves were true, the difference by income is likely not causal. That income is a marker for something else about people that makes them more or less likely to participate. But either way, it suggests that low income people and high income people are being equivalently motivated by payment. What we may be concerned about if we're concerned about unjust inducement, oops, wrong way, is this, where now you can see that the slope of the curve for lower income people has changed such that any given incremental amount of money being offered is preferentially motivating among those who have less of it. This is probably, actually, let me do one more slide, which is this, to show you the comparable results from that study I did as a graduate student, showing you that here there was no interaction between payment and income. If you're concerned that that p-value is getting close to 0.05, good observation, but actually what it's showing is that among poorer people, there's relatively little difference between $1,000 and $2,000 in terms of how motivating it is. And I think that's not what we're concerned about when we're concerned about unjust inducement, where we'd actually be concerned that the poorer people are being much more strongly motivated with each incremental monetary amount. So let me pause here and take any clarifying questions or any other questions, because I think like understanding these statistical analogs, if you will, of the normative constructs is kind of important to wrap your head around everything else I'm going to share.
Okay, great. Thanks, Scott. John Mertz asks, was race and ethnicity of the respondents in this study assessed? And how does that relate to income? Is there any confounding there?
Yeah, great question, John. Yes, they were assessed. We treated them as covariates in all of our models. So these results are adjusted for race and ethnicity. We did not look for differences in influence of payment by race and ethnicity in this sample because it was simply too small a sample for those analyses to have been adequately powered.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment, Scott, so you're welcome to proceed.
Great. There have also been some potential ethical benefits of financial incentives that have been hypothesized. Neil Dickert and Christine Grady, in a great piece from, can't believe it's more than 20 years ago now, had hypothesized that, but because we're not used to paying people for clinical care, that by using payment in the context of research, it might actually thwart what many ethicists had noted was a concerning problem in the conduct of clinical trials, which they've termed the therapeutic misconception, which is the idea that research has as its primary goal the benefit of individual participants rather than the production of generalizable knowledge. That is a misconception in sort of how one thinks about clinical research. And it was just a hypothesis from Neil and Christine that by offering payment, you may actually reduce that therapeutic misconception. Zeke quipped in a rather humorous article from another number of years ago that if you really want the IRB to pay attention to your study, the thing you should do is you should include financial incentives, because that'll get their attention very quickly and they'll attend to risk and, much better than they might otherwise. And that's, of course, what we want IRBs to do, is attend to risk. So that's a good way to sort of signal to IRBs, like, this is something you should really pay attention to. Again, not an evidence-based hypothesis, but I have a hypothesis about a potential benefit. And then one that we have a little bit of evidence on is that analogously, payment might serve as a signal of risk for research participants. And this actually was studied by a group that includes Kevin Volpe and some scholars who either remain or at the time were at Carnegie Mellon, where they took some samples of people, some people who were walking around the city of Pittsburgh and some online readers of the New York Times, and they presented them with different randomized trials and told them that they'd get different amounts of money for participating. And they asked them to evaluate the risk. And they come up with this like compared riskiness scale that's shown here, where for a series of 9 questions, you're asked, does the study that we just described to you seem more risky than any of these sort of more understandable behaviors, like flying on a plane, receiving the flu vaccine, driving 15 miles an hour over the speed limit, et cetera. And for every one activity that the respondents said the study sounded riskier than, they got a point on the compared riskiness scale. So the scale goes from like 0 to 9, and this is what they found. There we go. That when they offered $25, the median risk was 2, and when they offered $1,000, the median risk was 3, and that was statistically higher. Suggesting, now of course the risks of the trials they were describing weren't any different at all, so it was purely a perception. So people were sort of inferring risk, like, why are they giving me all this money? Maybe there's something I need to be worried about by the amount of payment that was being offered. So again, this is hypothetical research, and so may or may not bear out in the real world. But the other thing they found is that people actually spent more time reading the risk sections of the informed consent forms. So there's two different trials here, a phlebotomy trial, which is labeled blood, and a trial of transcranial magnetic stimulation. And you can see that for each one, the more money that was being offered, the more minutes people spent viewing the risk section of the informed consent form, which again, all things equal, might actually be a good thing. Like, we want people to be reading the informed consent forms, or at least asking questions about it. So the big question, thus far is, so what do we do with, that so-so study I did as a graduate student, and the paper by Kreider et al. And there were a few other papers that I haven't mentioned, also using hypothetical designs. Like, is this really sufficient to address the fundamental normative issues? And is this really sufficient evidence to guide investigators, sponsors, institutional review boards, and other stakeholders about how we ought to be using incentives or not using incentives for research participation? And I would say no, it just isn't. Like, we know that what people say they will do and what they say regarding how different influences would actually impact their choices simply doesn't always translate into how those same influences materialize in the real world. And so that's simply not a high enough evidentiary standard to result in normatively grounded policy or evidence-based policy. So we wrote a grant to take it to the next level and test the real world effects of financial incentives in real randomized trials. And this is the protocol paper for the studies. And we call this the RETAIN study. RETAIN stands for Randomized Evaluation of Trial Acceptability by Incentive. We had to capitalize the I and the N to make the acronym work, but otherwise you get it. And this was a great collaborative effort from a team of investigators here in the Pear Center, at CHIBE, at other parts of the University of Pennsylvania. And importantly, we partnered with two different real randomized trials. One was a trial of smoking cessation interventions run by Robbie Schnall here at Penn and Brian Hitzman, who's at Northwestern. And then a second trial of a gamification intervention to promote ambulation among hospitalized patients. That was led by Ryan Grayson, our chief of hospitalist medicine, and Mitesh Patel, who used to run the Nudge unit here at Penn. And the target sample size for each of the two embedded randomized trials of incentives within each of these parent RCTs was 576. And it was the same in both because we had the same hypotheses that we were testing in each of two trials. And we were using the same statistical methods. And we proposed to analyze the data in each of the two trials completely independently. This target sample size was achieved by a statistical calculation about the numbers of people that we would need to quote unquote rule out undue or unjust inducement. And I'll show you what I mean by ruling that out and why I'm kind of putting it in quotes in a later slide. There was a single data safety monitoring board with oversight over both trials. And in addition, because of the nature of this work, we decided to have a separate independent ethics advisory board that guided us on a number of key decisions we made in the design of this research. So here are the relevant folks. If you don't like this scholarship, I get all the blame, and none of these people do. If you do like what I'm about to share, then many of these people do get some of the credit. I'll just leave it there for your perusal for a moment, and I'll move along. Okay, so now let me describe to you what we actually did. So this is a generalized schemata of each embedded trial. So we assessed people for eligibility in the parent trial, that is the smoking cessation trial or the gamification intervention for ambulation. And if they met eligibility criteria, or at least initially met eligibility criteria for those parent trials, we proceeded to randomize them to one of three incentive groups, either $0, a low incentive, or a high incentive. And I'll show you what I mean by those. The low incentive was either $100 in the ambulation RCT or $200 in the smoking cessation RCT. The high incentive was $300 in the ambulation and $500 in the smoking cessation. Maybe we can talk during the Q&A about why we settled on those amounts and why they were a little bit different. But the point is we wanted to have a $0 group so we could assess decision-making in the absence of payment as an important contrast. And then we wanted to have two different incentive groups so that we could assess some semblance of dose responsiveness. After they were randomized, but before we told them anything, we collected a variety of baseline measures, their general attitudes towards research, a variety of demographic characteristics to the extent that they weren't otherwise being collected by the parent trial, et cetera. We then described the parent trial using the same informed consent process that the ambulation and smoking cessation RCTs were using anyway, except that we added to those informed consent processes a description of the amount of money they would get. And in those who were in the $0 arm, we explicitly said you will not be paid for participating in this trial, which is required in informed consent documents that do not use money. And in those where we were offering money, we mentioned the amounts, which is also required. The primary outcome was their decision to enroll or to sign the informed consent form to the parent trial. And then we measured a variety of secondary outcomes as well, which I'll get to in a bit. And then finally, at the end, once we had collected all of the data that we needed for our purposes of evaluating incentives, we debriefed participants. We explained that they had been randomized to different amounts of money, and we explained the reasons why we did that. And we further explained that, in fact, everyone who had agreed to participate would get the maximal incentive. We did this because we thought it was equitable, that this way we weren't paying people different amounts for undergoing the same activities. And there was no particular reason other than the cost not to do that. And we wanted to prevent any disgruntlement. All right, so here's the paper. Again, I'm presenting it on behalf of a really wonderful team of people. And I just want to specifically highlight Elisa Stevens-Shields, who's in our Department of Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Informatics. Elisa was an amazing collaborator on this work. For those of you who are involved in randomized trials, you know that it's customary for the senior statistician on a paper to take the second author position, not the senior author position, but Elisa's contributions were really just so substantive here that she absolutely merited senior authorship. We worked together really every step of the way, and she made the work much more rigorous than it otherwise would have been. So I've already described the two parent RCTs, and I already mentioned the primary outcome, which was the same in both trials, so I'm going to move along. Here are the consort diagrams for each of the two trials, the smoking cessation trial on the left and the ambulation trial on the right. And you can see that people were initially screened for their eligibility. There were different exclusion reasons in both studies, primarily that they either were ineligible for the parent RCT or that they were not available for screening. And then among those who were screened, the overwhelming majority in the smoking cessation trial were then randomized to either $0, $200, or $500. And in the ambulation trial, you can see that there were a number of people who sort of fell out because it was subsequently found that they didn't have a compatible smartphone, which was actually required for participating in this gamification intervention for the ambulation study, but doesn't have any sort of material relevance to what we're talking about today. And then they were randomized to $0, $100, or $300. These are the primary and secondary outcomes. So the primary outcome, as I mentioned, was consent rate. So you can see that in the smoking cessation trial on the left, the higher the incentive, the higher the enrollment rate. 22% with $0, 36% with $200, and 47% with $500, more than a doubling of the enrollment rate from $0 to $500 in that trial. By contrast, in the ambulation trial, the baseline willingness to participate in the absence of money was much higher at 45%, and it didn't change at all as we added higher incentives. I can get back to why that may be. But one of the reasons it may be is this, that people just didn't think that the ambulation trial was at all risky, and frankly, they were right. So only about 2 to 6% across arms in the ambulation trial thought there was any risk at all, meaning on that compared riskiness scale that I showed you, pretty much everyone said that those activities like driving 15 miles an hour over the speed limit or bungee jumping or what have you, almost everyone said that 100% of those activities were riskier than the trial itself. By contrast, about half of people thought that the smoking cessation trial was riskier than at least one, if not multiple, of those other activities of living. But that rate didn't vary by incentive. So this is some real world data in contrast to what the Kreider study had shown. There wasn't really much going on in the sense that people were inferring risk from payment in this setting. And then some secondary outcomes, all of which were non-significant. So I'll just briefly mention that in both of these trials, there was no evidence that in the face of money, people spent more time reviewing the informed consent documents. There was no evidence that money decreased the perceptions of therapeutic misconception, or TM. There was no effect of payment on people's understanding or knowledge of the trial, and there was no effect of payment on people's perceptions that they were coerced into participating. And in general, you can also see that the rates of perceptions of coercion were very low, in addition to not varying across study arms. So now let me explain the meaty data, undue and unjust inducement. So we tested undue inducement in two different ways. The main way we did it was we hypothesized that incentives would not modify what we presume to be an inverse relationship between risk perception and enrollment by some amount greater than delta. And I'll explain what I mean by delta here, but you have to, when seeking to rule something out in a non-inferiority design rather than rule something in a traditional superiority design, you have to pick an amount by which you would say that that's kind of close enough to zero to say that the two things are the same, or that the thing you are evaluating for did not manifest, right? You can't prove a zero effect. And this was actually one of the concerns with the trial, which I'll get to. So we'll pick a delta, and the hypothesis is that incentives are not going to modify that relationship by something greater than delta. And then the secondary way we look at it is in a more traditional superiority framework. We hypothesize that incentives would not modify what we presume to be a direct relationship, and in fact found to be a direct relationship between people who have favorable research attitudes are more likely to participate, all else equal. And indeed they were, but we were predicting that payment wouldn't modify that relationship. So let me talk a little bit more about non-inferiority testing, because I get that this is not the most familiar concept. So on an odds ratio scale, 1.0 is a perfect null effect. That's the zero effect. And the higher the odds ratio of the interaction term, in this case between risk and payment, the more the data would be consistent with our construct of undue inducement. And the lower the odds ratio, that is the closer to zero, which is defined by 1 over the interaction odds ratio. So like if this were like a normal linear scale, we might have 0 in the middle and +1 at the right extreme and -1 at the left extreme. On an odds ratio scale, it can't go below 0. So it's 1 over the odds ratio is the equivalent distance to the left, if that makes sense. So for example, we specified 2.0 as the non-inferiority margin, the delta that I mentioned on the prior slide, as the interaction odds ratio of interest. So on the left, 1 over that is an odds ratio of 0.5. And in the top version of this schematic that I'm showing you, those data, which are just made up data, that's consistent with establishing non-inferiority by the margin that we specified, because the upper limit of the 95% confidence interval, which is reflected by the dotted horizontal line, is still below or left of the interaction odds ratio on the right. By contrast, the next two examples would not have been sufficient to quote unquote rule out undue inducement, because in both cases, the upper 95% confidence interval crosses the interaction odds ratio. And the only distinction I'm drawing here is that in the middle portrayal, the point estimate, the effect that the data are most consistent with, is identical as in the first example, but there's more variance. And hence the 95% confidence interval is wider. And that would not be compatible with ruling out undue inducement, even though the point estimate of the most likely effect is identical. And then in the final case, I'm showing that the variance is actually the same, but the point estimate is shifted to the right such that the tail exceeds the interaction odds ratio. Let me pause just briefly here for any clarifying questions, because I get that it's a tricky concept.
So Scott, I don't see any clarifying questions on this just yet, but I will note that it's we only have about 13 minutes before we have to close. So
Okay.
maybe we should wrap things up. There are some questions coming into the chat more generally about the paper and the talk.
Great. So these are the data. You can see that in both cases, the point estimate of the undue inducement effect was actually less than 1, so not consistent with undue inducement. And in neither case did the upper 95% confidence interval come anywhere close to the 2.0 range that we had established. So no evidence of undue inducement. I'm going to skip through this, but we basically just recognized that the definition of 2.0 was a bit arbitrary. So we wanted to look to see how robust these findings were by using lower non-inferiority margins. And you can see that for the smoking trial, had we specified a non-inferior odds ratio of 1.6, we still would have reached the same conclusion. And had we gone as low as 1.8 in the ambulation trial, we still would have reached the same conclusion. And then in our secondary analysis of the relationship between favorable research attitudes and enrollment, again, there was nothing going on here, no significant relationships between payment modifying that relationship in either trial. And then testing for for unjust inducement, we do this in two different ways. We look to see whether income modifies the relationship between incentive size and enrollment rate, and whether financial well-being, recognizing that income is not a perfect marker for financial stress. There are validated scales of financial well-being, so we use that as a secondary measure. And the upshot is that neither income, as shown here, relatively parallel curves, nor unjust inducement, as shown here, again, relatively parallel curves, modified the relationship between incentive and the probability of enrollment. So no evidence for unjust inducement. So this was the accompanying editorial, and I'm just about to wrap up. Some things I agree with, and some things I'll push back on that these scholars raised. So first, they say that the work was welcome because it provided experimental data to a bioethical debate that so far has been largely driven by conjecture and competing suppositions. I certainly agree. That was exactly what we were motivated by doing. And these were their three concerns. The first is basically what we all, or any of us who have done the master's in bioethics at Penn or elsewhere, probably one of the first things we learned is that you can't derive ought from is, which is that you can't use descriptive data to impart normative propriety. And I agree with that to an extent, but I would say that when the normative arguments rest on empirically testable assumptions about human behavior, then the empirical evidence can actually go a long way towards guiding the normative debate. And so I think the authors would probably agree with that too, but they were just sort of making that as a general ethical point, which is sort of hard to argue with. The second point they made is that the definition of undue inducement that we used was not the one that all ethicists would use. And indeed, that's true. But I think we used one that is the most preponderant definition in the literature. And regardless, we used a slightly different definition in the hypothetical studies, and the conclusions were exactly the same. And then finally, they made the point that non-inferiority designs are unfamiliar to bioethicists. That may be true, but that's not a reason not to use the most rigorous statistical methods. And that non-inferiority designs can't prove a zero effect, which is unambiguously true. They're absolutely right there. But we have to, because that's never possible, we have to have some space within which we can say, this has ruled out what we think to be important effects such that we're comfortable proceeding. And that's just the way it is. And then finally, something that I would agree with, they've highlighted what I would say is sort of a shifting burden of proof, that given that most normative analyses, the data from hypothetical situations, and now the data from real world situations all align with the conclusion that incentives in research participation do not manifest as either undue or unjust inducements, that we may not see fit to use incentives in all RCTs. In fact, we shouldn't, right? Because they didn't actually even work in the ambulation trial, but that the burden of proof now rests or ought to rest on those who would limit the use of incentives, not on those who wish to employ them. And I'll leave you with that's essentially these conclusions, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great. Well, Scott, we could talk about this for a long time, but there are questions in the chat already, so I'm going to defer to folks who have put them in there. Susan Ellenberg, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or would you like me to read it?
I can do it.
Go ahead.
So Scott, I was interested in whether you wanted to comment on how the issues differ between phase 1 clinical trials, which in most circumstances, other than cancer, involve healthy people who have no benefit to gain, but only possible risks, and who are always paid for such research, and randomized clinical trials where people do have both benefits and risks to gain.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, it's an important question. My short answer is that at a conceptual level, I don't think the issues are any different. That different trials have different benefit and risk profiles, and that people with more or fewer comorbid illnesses have different underlying influences on the choices that they would make. And the same approach to evaluation could be deployed in all sorts of randomized trials. That said, what we've done here is we've tested this in the setting of 2 specific randomized trials. And these results do not necessarily generalize to the context that you're talking about, phase 1 trials of experimental interventions. And so we ought not necessarily conclude that the same results would be found in that context. That's something we should actually evaluate. But I do think the same methods could be deployed in that evaluation because the conceptual paradigms of undue and unjust inducement are not any different.
Great, thanks. Carmen, do you want to ask Scott your question?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. Hi, Scott. Great talk. Thank you so much. I was wondering about the concept of trust and whether you had thought about measuring that in any of your studies or in future work, because what I guess I would hypothesize is that if a population has high levels of trust in research or science, that your results would be the same. But I did wonder if low trust in science and research could give you the opposite results, more distrusting. Now you're paying me, there must be something high risk involved or something wrong. And I thought of that because we had that experience with the COVID vaccine and paying people for the COVID vaccine. Those who needed a little push went, and then it backfired and created more distrust in the vaccine. And it's just a different era now, right? With misinformation about science. This is a greater problem that I wonder if it's more prevalent than some of your earlier studies. So I'd love your comments.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carmen. So as it turns out, in our original protocol, we actually we were concerned about the same thing, or at least interested in the same thing. So we'd actually built in an assessment of health system trust using a scale that actually you may have been involved in the generation of, Carmen. I can't remember. Katrina Armstrong was the first author of the scale that I'm thinking of. And we had actually sought to include that in our battery of instruments. We wound up excluding it for some logistical reasons that I won't bore you with, but instead chose to try and address it by doing some embedded qualitative research that was led by Emily Largent and Tamar Clayman and some others, and will be coming soon to a journal near you. That really probes that and other issues in a more concerted way. I don't have the data at my disposal quite yet, but I do agree completely that it's a salient issue and one that future scholarship should investigate, and hopefully Emily's work will shed some light on.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Steve?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. I'm curious about your thoughts about when and whether we should use we can set aside concerns about unjust and undue inducement based on your work, or at least, like to be able to think that. But when is it a good idea now to use incentives and when not? And even just for sort of research purposes, when's it a good idea to spend the money to use incentives?
Yeah, I think this is another topic that Emily's work may shed some light on. But I think if I had to predict the truly low risk, like almost borderline zero risk research, like that ambulation trial, it's probably not likely that you're going to move the needle much with incentives. We do know from some prior both qualitative and quantitative studies that we and others have done that there's a broad universe of reasons that people do or don't participate in randomized trials. The prospect of remuneration being only one of a long number of them. And so because of all of those other influences on that decision, in the absence of risk, it's simply unlikely that paying people any amount that we would deem to be, compatible with budgets, it is just unlikely to move the needle very much. That said, even the smoking cessation trial we used here is not a super high risk study. And hearkening back to Susan Ellenberg's comment, I think we just need more tests of this, particularly in much higher risk situations, both to evaluate the effectiveness of incentives in that study. You might imagine that it's sort of a inverse U-shaped curve along risk, like the amount that payment will influence. Like with a little bit of risk, it might move the needle. With no risk at all, it won't. And with a lot of risk, it hopefully won't, in fact. But I think we just need a couple more studies to shed light on that.
Okay, great. Well, Scott, this will, I'm sure, not be your last bit of work in this area. So we really appreciate you presenting it to us. And we have a lot of additional questions in the chat, which we can pass along to you, but we have to close now that we're at time. So thanks again for joining us. And we hope that you all will join us for the final reps of the year next month. Thanks, everyone.